Tonight on KQED Newsroom, we consider billions of dollars in proposed budget cuts as California grapples with the financial fallout from the pandemic. Plus, transportation woes mount as riders and drivers stay home, but getting around may get much harder when businesses reopen. Plus, two major Bay Area museum directors share their comeback strategies for reopening in the months ahead. Hello and welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. It's week 9 of sheltering in place in Northern California. More than 87,000 people have now died from COVID-19 in the United States. On Thursday, California Governor Gavin Newsom unveiled a revised state budget that calls for steep cuts to public schools and a pay cut for state workers. California is facing a budget deficit of more than $54 billion due to declining tax revenues and soaring job losses. Also this week, California state senators returned to Sacramento. Among their proposals, 2 innovative relief packages, which would help people stay in their homes. Meanwhile, House Democrats are proposing a new $3 trillion round of federal aid, despite opposition from the White House and Senate Republicans. Joining us now from San Francisco are KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Scott Schaefer, and KQED Politics and Government Correspondent, Marisa Lagos. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thanks, Priya.
It's been all about the Benjamins this week, whether we're talking at the state or the federal level. Let's talk about the HEROES Act, which is the Democrats' new $3 trillion proposal for coronavirus relief. What compromises would need to be made in order for this 5th coronavirus relief package to actually become a reality?
Well, I think, in fact, it may never become a reality, and Democrats in the House generally know that. This is something that Republicans have opposed in terms of the details. And even within the Democratic caucus, there are disagreements about how much of that $3 trillion should go to individuals versus to local governments, state and county governments, cities as well. So there is money in there, including $25 billion for the post office, which President Trump says he doesn't want. There's money to fund an all-mail election, vote-by-mail election in November. The Republicans don't want that. So those are just a couple examples of things that Republicans don't want. But there are even some Democrats who are, as I said, are unhappy about some of the things in their own package. And
Maurice, the progressives have also said they will not vote for this particular bill.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is a starting point, right? These are sort of the Christmas tree wish list. I think it is a negotiation tactic by Pelosi. Yeah, on the left flank of the party, they would like to see this go further. I think that Pramila Jayapal, the head of the Progressive Caucus, has a bill that she wanted Pelosi to fold in that was going to give more direct aid to workers in the attempt to avoid more layoffs, similar to the Paycheck Protection Program. I think among the more centrist Democrats, they want to see some provisions that would essentially let a lot of these programs that have already been passed, like the extra $600 a week in unemployment money, phase out depending on the economy. Right now, there's sort of a cliff where that ends on July 31st. But look, there's going to be pressure from both blue and red states on some of these issues, especially the direct aid to government. And I do think that, Pelosi wanted to get this out there and show what she wanted and where she wanted to start these talks. And I'm not ready to say it's going to go one way or the other yet, because things seem to change so quickly in Washington. And I do think there's going to be political pressure from some red states on those senators like Mitch McConnell who don't want to play ball right now.
Let's turn to California. Let's talk about the state government and the state budget. Governor Newsom has come out with his revised budget proposal. It's about $20 million less than the original proposal, which was $222 billion while we were flush, the largest ever. Now we're staring at this $54 billion deficit. Scott, describe for us where the cuts are coming from.
Well, the good news is, unlike the last Great Recession, California was in pretty good shape. It had paid down its debt. A lot of the debt going into this budget year. The year began with about $5.5 billion in surplus. There's about $16 billion in the rainy day fund. So all of those things will help cushion the blow, and that's really good news. In addition, he's going to have to scale back and basically eliminate the $6 billion in program enhancements that were in his January budget, things that he wanted to do around housing, climate change, and so on, that he just, the money is just not there. There's also going to be some internal borrowing, shifting of money from things like the tobacco tax to help pay for Medicaid. There's going to be federal money, about $8 billion already allocated by the federal government to help with costs related to the pandemic. And then there's also not a tax increase, but a tax credit that would be suspended for some time to create several $1 billion in revenue. And so those are just some of the broad strokes of what's in there. And he's also going to stretch this out. He's not going to just drain the rainy day fund this year or next. He wants to stretch that out over 3 years, hope that the economy improves more quickly than some fear that it will. And so I think they're also trying to learn from the last time by not just eliminating programs, but rather by scaling back the increase or reducing funding in a way that these programs can be saved once the economy recovers or once the federal government comes through with money. And I should say, too, that the governor is saying, look, we can avoid a lot of these cuts right now if the federal government just sends us money. So he's kind of putting it on Donald Trump's doorstep.
Right. Marisa, the governor didn't say that taxes would go up to close the budget deficit. But do you think that may change? And if so, what might trigger that change?
I think not anytime soon. At a time when people are losing their jobs or struggling to stay in their homes, the last thing any governor wants to do, Republican or Democrat, is ask them for taxes. There is a ballot measure that would raise billions of dollars for state programs. It is not being run by the state. It's being run by labor unions. It would roll back some of those provisions of the Prop 13 property taxes so that commercial properties can see their taxes go up. I think the governor is probably hoping that passed. He hasn't endorsed it yet, but I really think it's too early for that conversation. I think they're going to try to paper this over and see what happens at the federal level, both with that legislation we discussed and also, of course, with the election in November, which could completely change the dynamic nationally and in the state of California.
Scott, state senators have proposed a $25 billion rental assistance package. How did they arrive at the number, and what's in this package?
Well, there was a study a couple of years ago that showed there's about 17 million renters in California, and about half of them on a regular basis struggle to pay their rents. And so when this pandemic hit, obviously there was a lot of concern that an already bad homeless problem would be made worse by people not being able to pay their rents and landlords kicking them out. So Newsom, the governor, issued a moratorium on evictions, but a lot of people felt that didn't go far enough because renters were still going to be on the hook for back pay. So what they're now saying is, look, why don't we, if landlords will cooperate, say that we will give them a long-term tax break in exchange for forgiving that rent, and then renters will agree to pay the state the rent over the course of about a decade without interest. So you'd have to have landlords willing to play ball on that. Not all of them will, and of course they don't have to, but the idea is to try to keep as many people in their homes as possible.
Maurice, let's turn to unemployment. I'm hearing estimates from 20 to 25% unemployment projected in California. In the past, high unemployment has tended to create political change. Do you expect the same to happen here?
You know, I think this is such an unprecedented moment. I mean, we went from the budget surplus, the lowest unemployment in history, to what might be the highest unemployment in history overnight. I think this is really going to depend on a lot of factors, including what happens with the coronavirus testing, with contact tracing, with therapies, with vaccines, some of which are completely out of the hands of state and local leaders, right? And I think that it's really going to depend on how voters view this. Like right now, you've seen Newsom be very popular. He's really taken charge. He's been having these daily press conferences. There's a lot of anger on the left at Donald Trump. This has become a partisan issue, but in California, as we know, Democrats or leaning Democrats, when you add in those nonpartisan voters, are really the vast majority. Republicans don't have a lot of power here. So I don't anticipate that sort of upending political life here, but I do think it could have a huge impact on what happens nationally in November. And that, of course, would have an impact on the state budget and therefore the governor's political fortunes.
Let's talk a little bit about the GOP this week, which had a couple of wins, congressional wins in Wisconsin and California. It's the first time a House Republican seat has flipped in California since 1998. Scott, can you tell me, is this a harbinger of growing Republican strength that we could witness in the general election?
Probably not. Off-year elections, this was a special election at an odd time, tend to favor Republicans. In November, when these two will face off again, Mike Garcia, who will then be the incumbent, and Christy Smith, who lost, this week. They will go at it again in November, and the electorate in a presidential election is going to be very different. It'll be much more Democratic. That said, Mike Garcia is a very good candidate for this district. Former Navy fighter pilot. This is a district where Edwards Air Force Base is. He's also Latino, the son of Mexican immigrants. So he's a good candidate for that district, which Hillary Clinton won, but Donald beat Donald Trump by 7 points. But Gavin Newsom, who won very easily statewide, only won this district by 2 points. So it's a very purple district. And so while it doesn't necessarily mean that the Republicans are going to hold on to it in November, they're going to have to work to get it back because it does have a history of electing Republicans.
KQED's Scott Schaefer and Marisa Lagos, thank you both so much.
Thanks
Thanks,
you.
Priya.
This week, BART joined more than a dozen transit agencies across the nation asking Congress for $33 billion in additional aid for public transportation. BART alone is facing a $600 million deficit as ridership on its trains is down more than 90%. Bay Area transit agencies are getting more than $1 billion from the first round of federal relief approved in March. The next big challenge, assuring commuters that it's safe to use their buses, trains, and ferries when the region eventually reopens. Joining me now from Berkeley is KQED transportation editor and reporter Dan Brekke. Dan, thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Dan, one of the perks of the pandemic, if you will, is that the traffic has been much lighter. But a recent study out of Vanderbilt suggests that once the shelter-in-place lifts, traffic will come roaring back and it will be a very heavy congestion situation on the roads. What do you see occurring?
Well, that's a big question. The study does suggest that if people stay off of transit the way they are now, then we're going to see terrible traffic on the road. And anecdotally, you hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm not going to go back on BART, I'm not going to go back on Muni or AC Transit because I just don't feel comfortable doing it. The impact of that could be anywhere from a commute that's 10 to 40 minutes longer each way, depending on how many people abandon transit.
That's pretty significant, 10 to 40 minutes.
10 to 40 minutes. So imagine how bad your commute is now. The MTC, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, already says that we've got 17, 18 hours a day of solid congestion leading to the Bay Bridge from San Francisco side, and that will become a lot worse.
So Twitter announced this week that many of its employees could continue to work from home permanently. Telecommuting is certainly the wild card here. Pull out your Dan Brekke crystal ball. How much do you see a need and a desire for people to gather in person in the coming months?
Well, listen, every enterprise, including ours at KQED, there's a huge benefit to in-office collaboration. And those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to work from home have been pushed all over the Bay Area and beyond. We have people at KQED, for instance, who are working from Humboldt County. So, it's hard to say, that that's a big benefit to the companies. But the thing is, it does make people safer and it keeps them apart at a time when we're dealing with a very infectious disease. It's just very hard to know how much that's going to continue or how broadly. But planning for transit, that situation makes it almost impossible for the agencies to guess what's going to happen over the next year or two.
And these agencies have seen significant decreases in their ridership. Golden Gate Transit, Caltrain, BART, Muni have seen their ridership drop by 90% or more. What does recovery start to look like as we come out of shelter in place for these agencies?
It's going to be a long, slow recovery. BART had a meeting yesterday where their best case scenario is to have just 50% of their previous ridership in the coming year. So the other agencies are dealing with very similar pictures where it's greatly reduced ridership and also greatly reduced revenues because of fewer fares being collected and much lower taxes that support these services being collected.
And because of this lowered revenue, BART and other transit agencies across the nation are asking for $33 billion in additional funding. This is on top of the $25 billion that they already got. What happens if they don't get this funding in the next few months?
Well, if they don't get the funding, I think there's no doubt we're going to see massive layoffs in some of these agencies. One of the plans put forward at BART, and it would be a worst case scenario where trains are only running every 60 minutes or something like that. More than 1,000 workers out of the 3,500 they have could be laid off. And I think that's what they're facing if there's no further federal aid. And really at this point, the federal government is, which is us, we're paying the taxes. The federal government is really the only recourse for most of these agencies.
Dan, many of us have been on a crowded train platform or a crowded bus. It's hard to see that happening in an age of social distancing. What sorts of measures are agencies currently thinking about to put into place to continue some form of social distancing as we come out of shelter in place? It probably won't be as strict as it is right now because they just won't be able to fit that many people on their trains and buses.
Well, so that's one thing that they have to figure is what loads they can carry to maintain certain kinds of physical distancing. So that is the first challenge. But I think they also really have to reassure the public in every way possible that it's safe to get on the trains and buses and ferries. So what does that mean? That means really raising their games in terms of cleaning, in terms of really policing what's going on the vehicles. And that's going to be a big challenge. For instance, in BART's case, there's an extra $75 million line item for the coming year to pay for all the cleaning that is going to be necessary to make people feel safe.
Let's turn to equity. Public transit is one of the few places in our society where all segments interact. At least it had been. But as this crisis has gone on, one of the things we've seen is that people with more money were able to switch to telecommuting more easily. Do you think this will lead public transit agencies to move their planning to have more transit-dependent ridership in their focus?
I think agencies like Muni especially have been really thinking about this hard, about how to maintain this core of service for people who really don't have any option. They're also focusing on the essential workers. And essential workers aren't just professionals or doctors or something like that. They're all the people we've been hearing about, frontline workers in our grocery stores, custodians, security guards, and all the rest. And so yes, I think you can expect to see a renewed focus on how to maintain service for those folks. But I think it's also going to lead to a period where we really try to look at solutions to make transportation, public transit, more accessible to people who are having a tough time making ends meet.
Dan Brekke, KQED transportation editor and reporter, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
As the pandemic closures drag on, Bay Area museums are scrambling to stay solvent. Art museums have closed their doors, covered their paintings, and turned out the lights. Other institutions have a core team still caring for animals and other living exhibits. All are facing significant budget shortfalls. And by some industry estimates, 1/3 of all museums nationwide won't be able to afford to reopen. Joining me now to discuss the future of Bay Area museums is Jay Hsu, Director and CEO of the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco, and Scott Sampson, Executive Director of the California Academy of Sciences. Jay and Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Scott, let's start with you. Tell me about your plans for reopening. What will visitors experience when they come to the Cal Academy in the coming months if you reopen then?
Well, of course, the post-COVID world is going to be different than the pre-COVID world. And our first priority, of course, is to make a safe experience for our visitors and for our staff. We're going to be probably looking at timed entry to prevent overcrowding, limiting gathering sizes, and closing up our theater, for example, our planetarium, at least to start building on our cleaning and sanitation practices. And actually, we see sort of a 3-phase opening, first with limited capacity, and we'll remove all the high-touch exhibits. Then we'll go to phase 2, where we'll still keep social distancing, and finally, phase 3, where we hope to go back to effective normal, if that exists anymore.
And when are you hoping to launch phase 1?
Well, we are hopeful of opening July 1st, but that's going to depend on state and local mandates from public health officials, and we're going to be monitoring all of that very closely.
Jay, what are your plans for reopening the Asian Art Museum? When do you plan to reopen, and what changes will visitors see?
Yeah, here at the Asian Art Museum, our visitor's journey always starts at home. So I encourage everyone to check out the offerings on the website and all the kinds of wonderful programs. Right now, we are turning our museum into a virtual museum with much enhanced programs. So when we be able to open the physical museum to the public. We want to encourage our visitors to do the same. And once they are on site, we do a lot of the similar implementation as Scott just mentioned to ensure social distancing, ample sanitation station, and also we encourage everyone to wear masks. Our museum store will carry beautifully designed branded masks, and we're vigorously wiping down all such places. We encourage people to load up our apps so that we can avoid getting close to the labels when you're reading about the background information about our works. So we want to find a fine balance between artistic experience and safety. Right now, we're planning to open the museum on July 1st, but we will be nimble. We want to make sure the safety comes first.
Scott, how are you planning for social distancing, and how many people will be able to come to the museum daily compared to what it was pre-COVID?
Well, it's amazing. We are an institution of science, so I guess it's not surprising that we approach that problem scientifically. So we started by assuming that everyone needed 6-foot social distancing, and if a person is a foot wide, that means you need a circle 7 feet in diameter. We then took our total square footage of about 185,000 square feet, both indoor and outdoor public space, and we calculated how many of these 7-foot diameter circles we could fit in. That gives us sort of the maximum number that we can fit in with social distancing, and then we calculate how many waves of those folks we could have over the course of the day to give us some sense about how many people we could expect.
And, you know, I've been to the museum with my kids. The indoor rainforest is a favorite, always. And you also have some hands-on interactive exhibits in your natural history space. How are those going to change?
Yeah, we'll take some of the hands-on natural history exhibits offline to start, so that won't be a problem. And then we'll just assure, we're looking at things like, is it possible to create one-way traffic so people aren't passing each other? So throughout, we are going to limit the number of touch points people have, physical touch points, and these opportunities for getting within 6 feet of somebody else.
Jay, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about how you're transitioning, and you were doing this actually before COVID started, to have more outdoor exhibits.
Thank you. Last week was very poignant because we planned to open our expanded and transformed the museum to the public last week. Of course, this plan will need to be postponed to the fall, and some part will postpone to next spring. But may I say that we were planning as we were almost ahead of the curve in the sense that we are turning the museum inside out. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we are turning the museum's walls as our first galleries. So that on street level, there will be an art mural by Asian American artists, and above the street level, there's a glass lounge inside which there will be a wonderful mural by another Asian American artist to be designed to be viewed from outside. And then on top of that, we have arguably maybe the largest outdoor art terrace in the Bay Area, open space full of art, some of which are visible from the street.
And Scott, let's talk about your virtual offerings, which you've expanded during this time. How have those been received?
Yeah, it's been a remarkable interval for us. We have 40,000 live animals on site that are being taken care of every day. We've given people access to those animals through live animal webcams. We have virtual exhibits and scientific collections. We've live streamed chats with scientists. We've created this entity called Academy at Home, where whether you're a parent or a teacher, you can download activities, learning activities to do with kids that relate to nature. We're really promoting citizen science, getting people out into nature, of course, safely and socially distanced, but interacting with and connecting with the natural world. So in the post-COVID world, we really anticipate keeping these online offerings expanding on a regular basis.
And Jay, how has your online offering changed, and how is it being received?
Our online offering has been dramatically increased up. Not only we engage in visual artists for live events, but also performing artists, and not only the artists, the artworks that in our collection, but also live demonstration of cooking, for example, and as well as meditation. I think art is always the substance by which humankind can come together, and we want a major role. And we're not only thinking of during this time, we'll continue our online offerings in the post-COVID-19 time. I think online engagement is essential for any museum going forward.
Absolutely. And Jay and Scott, I'd like to ask you both very quickly, just before we go. You know, there's funding is going to be difficult. COVID has punched a hole in both of your budgets and your operations. You rely not only on the ticket sales, but also on outside funding and donations. What argument do you have for why your museum should continue receiving funding and donation? Jay, let's start with you very quickly as we wrap up here.
Yeah, I consider Asia Museum fundamentally as a platform of education. We engage people for all generations, but particularly K-12. On the other hand, may I also say, right now we're confronting the rise of Asian racism. Asia Museum is taking a leadership role in combating that. And we're engaging artists, we're engaging students. So their investment in Asia Museum will go a long way in helping, we come together during COVID-19 and post, particularly in combating anti-Asian racism and enhance our common values and for what ACTA stands for all of us.
Thank you, Jay. I do need to move on to Scott. Scott, your argument for keeping the museum funded.
COVID-19 and species extinctions and the climate crisis have one thing in common: a broken relationship between humans and the natural world. So you can make an argument that the most pressing question facing humanity right now is how we transform the way that we interact with nature. So the Academy, which sits at the interface between people and nature, is ideally situated to be a profound influence on this conversation. We've been developing a new strategy that is all about integrating people in the natural world and helping people to see the intimate and inextricable connections that all of us have with nature. So we're excited about carrying that strategy forward and becoming ever more relevant in the post-COVID world.
Scott Scanson with the California Academy of Sciences, Jay Hsu with the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Priya.
As always, you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me through my social media handle, Priya D. Clemens. We're off next week. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Stay safe.